Hi guys, this is Joe Goodspeed from Diamondback Fly Rods. This is going to be episode 2 of our Designer's Angle feature. Today on this Designer's Angle, I'm going to talk about how some of my personal fishing experience going back in the last 10-15 years contributed to my ideas and concepts around rod design for nymphing rods and for overall rod design in general, but in particular for these families of European nymphing rods that I now am completing the 4th full range of nymphing rods that I've designed with these Generation IV Diamondback Nymph Rods. This is the 4th full series of tapers that I've designed, but going back to around 2011, 2012, when I worked at Cortland Line Company, and I was at Cortland Line, I was the product manager and I oversaw the fly line production room. So I did some fly line development and did some stuff with the machines themselves. And at that time, I was really big into indicator nymphing. I was huge in stomach pumping the fish, creating very accurate imitations of all the different stages of the mayflies, caddisflies, stoneflies, and other crustaceans that the fish would be feeding on. And in particular, I fished the west branch of the Delaware River a lot at that time, working in Cortland. That was about a less than hour drive to get down there. And at that time, I remember seeing in the industry this trend with the European nymphing starting to develop. At that time, Echo had come out with the original Shadow nymphing rods in 10.5 and 11 feet, I think 10.5, 11 feet. And Hardy's was coming out with the Grays series of nymphing rods at that time. And there were products like the Jan Simon bicolor indicator mono that was available in Europe that was not available in the United States. That was like a desired thing that people were trying to import in some of these specialty things from Europe that were hot in the nymphing scene. And at Cortland Line, I talked to the president and I said, I think that this is going to blow up in the industry and it makes sense for Cortland Line to make a big focus on these types of products. And after that, I got the go-ahead to do some rod development, which at that time it wasn't developing the actual tapers of the rods. It was working with exterior companies to get rods that were the length and weight that would be in the realm of what would be good nymphing products. But at the same time, I was doing fishing that started to break away from the indicator, using the indicators, and I forced myself to start to try to fish these tight line methods. And so at that time, I was using rods like a 10-foot 4-weight, and I was targeting a lot of big river trout that would eat bigger food items, and I was trying to figure out how to present those food items, what those food items would be that those bigger river trout would be interested in eating. And so across this whole spectrum of smaller to larger nymphing rods, I was trying to adapt my own fishing tactics from the small stuff that I would do on the Delaware River, imitating small mayfly nymphs or caddisflies, and using those 2 or 3 weight class rods to present those flies, up to doing the things that I was doing with 4 weights, where I was fishing with big crane fly larvas and the early crayfish flies that I was developing, and some stuff that was like sculpin flies that would be very heavy and bottom oriented, hellgrammites. There were a bunch of things that were bigger, heavier food items that I was trying to find a way to use those European nymphing type tight line tactics to adapt to target these really big river trout that were eating specific big food items like the baby crayfish flies, and trying to figure out how to have the equipment do the casting those flies and the type of fishing by feel, where the fish were biting the flies and there was no indicator on the line, so I was needing to have the rods create the strike detection, and also to be able to have the hook setting ability to have a rod that wasn't too tip heavy, that wasn't too much work on the wrist, where you could feel the bites and have the power to effectively drive that hook home and fight those fish. There was a certain balance of the amount of backbone you need and the amount of kind of tip mid power you need to drive the hook home, and the amount of tip sensitivity that would make that fishing work. And so for me, those years like 2012, 2013, 2014, that was a real transitional time for me fishing, that I dialed in a lot of these deep water tactics, and then also got a much better understanding of what the products needed to do to most effectively perform all of those different aspects of casting, hooking, fighting the fish, and also being lightweight, comfortable, and less work on the angler to accomplish those things. So when I'm developing a nymph rod now, I have this target in my mind of what that sort of transition of power ideally is going to be. And a lot of that comes from this period where I first started doing the nymphing tactics and had to adapt my own fishing strategies based on the things that I wanted to do, either that I hadn't been able to do or that I was doing with indicator nymphing, to get the rods that were the European nymphing rods, especially the early ones, to just figure out what sort of action that was going to work best for that, and also getting the time on the water using those rods to figure out firsthand some of those different aspects of what allows you to set the hook well, or what causes a fish to bounce off. All of those things. In order to design the rods well, you need to have a real concept goal, a target at the end of the day of what you're trying to achieve, to form the tapers, to alter the feeling, to make positive changes to a blank that makes it a more effective thing.
How were your early rod designs different from the current ones coming out in Gen 4?
Well, the material differences oftentimes are where you have the low-hanging fruit to improve the designs. And so right now, the Generation 4 rods, they're using a new material in the tip. And the whole rod is designed around that, that difference, because I design a rod from the top down, not from the bottom up. So when I change the tip, I'm going to, be forced to work in a different way below that new tip. For me, also, the concepts of the tapers have developed. And so from the Cortland rods to the TNT rods to the Diamondback rods, the reason that the stuff has changed a little bit is based on my own experience, and also based on how the market is changing, because the people's skill sets are changing. They have more experience, and the materials are improving. Everything, everything is kind of moving towards better performance stuff and more effective stuff. And for a designer, it raises the bar. There's a lot more products out there that are highly competitive products now, and there's more of a idea of what the products need to be. When you go back to what I was doing there at Cortland Line, there was not, especially in the larger sizes like the 4-weight nymph rod, there wasn't a very clear, I think, industry target, big and small. About the 3-weight nymph rods was the first thing that the industry started to get right, and then getting lighter rods that had good recovery and didn't fish like a noodle, and then having bigger rods that weren't so heavy and clumsy that they felt like a broomstick. It was harder to go up and down than it was to get around that nice 10.5-foot 3-weight type rod model, which is what I think for a number of companies that was about the easiest thing to dial in, because the tips don't need to be that thin and light, and that's the hard part about when you get down to a 2 or 1-weight rod. In the time between then and now, the industry, the materials have become spread thinner. And having a thinner cloth material where you're able to get more revolutions around the mandrel at those really thin diameters, that contributes to having more consistent actions and performance, and just the ability to go thinner and lighter comfortably for a rod designer. I know for me, I've seen those tip diameters get thinner, and the wall thickness, as the material gets thinner, your wall thickness is more consistent. So where you start and where you end, you get that kind of spline effect. And so all through the rod, having thinner materials where you get more revolutions around the mandrel with that pattern, that creates more consistent, performance and action across the tips. And that has been, for everybody in the industry, that thinner cloth materials has helped improve the products to, just the baseline for product performance has gone up an immense amount over the past 10 years based on nothing other than the material getting better, and also there kind of being a baseline target for what some of these rod models should be. In order to make them better than that, that's the hard design work. But once there's an established thing, it's pretty easy to see those diameter points and wall thicknesses and flex profiles on a deflection board and try to replicate that or get in the same ballpark once you know what's working and what's standard.
Do you think these new designs are going to change the way that people are designing flies, and where they can go with the fly design? The hook size going extremely small to bigger hooks. Is it opening a new door?
I see the size of the hooks of the popular flies that we're using, and the rods need to drive the hooks home. No matter what the fly is, having rods that are more versatile and can be more comfortable for the angler to be, maybe not necessarily a lighter rod, but a more comfortable rod to load and to have power in the places that you need to effectively set the hook, keep the fish hooked, and land the fish. So as my designs have moved on, my goals of comfort and versatility, how the ease of what it's like to use that rod to catch the fish with having less fatigue and maybe having less fish bounce off, and then trying to manipulate those rod tapers in a way that a rod can handle a wider range of hook sizes effectively, to have the finesse to really go light and have the type of taper through the middle bottom end of the rod where you have the power and rigidity to drive home a bigger hook. So to be able to do both of those things with the rod model, that's where I think some of the new Generation 4 rods are, making progress from my previous designs, because they're able to go comfortably smaller. They're more comfortable for the angler to load and fish them, and they still have the capability to do the higher end things as far as driving the bigger hook home and landing the bigger fish. So that's always, my goal for those new designs is the end user experience. How can that be, optimized, and how can that rod really do everything that someone needs it to do in a way that makes it easy, fun, comfortable for them to use it? I think where it will open more of a door is these rods are easier to load with really lightweight flies and really thin leaders. And so I think the door that's opening is the ability to control either single fly rigs or really light, fine flies that sink slower, and you can, control flies in different parts of the water column, and you don't need to have that big anchor fly or a little bit heavier fly to feel the rod load, or to make the longer cast and cover more water. Having rods that really load easily and work together with those lighter leaders to throw smaller, lighter bead flies further with control, that is a way to increase your success in a lot of different trout fishing situations.
Talked about using 10-foot 4-weight. How has your rod choice change from back then to what is available now and what you're designing?
So for me, with my personal fishing, those 4 weights have always been my baby. The 4 weights are the rod that when I am trout fishing and there's something that I really want to do, usually it's going after a large, wild, big river fish and trying to do, and for me to do that, having that 4 weight class rod gives me the tip power and the tip mid power. If I get a real trophy class fish that has just a bony, the big brown trout that I'm after with those 4 weights, they have very bony mouths. And so even with a very sharp hook, being able to get the penetration where you have a hook that might be a size 6 or 8, or even sometimes a 4, depending on what the food source is that I'm imitating, and being able to detect that bite, and it might be 60 feet across the river, 10 feet down, that there's a tap that I need to drive home a hook into a, big, heavy bone mouth wild fish that's trying to spit my fly out as soon as it feels it. That's the situation that when I'm designing a rod for those 4 weights, I know exactly what I want that 4 weight to be able to do. I want it to have the sensitivity to be able to, first of all, the flexibility and the action to be able to load a little bit with a fly that has some weight and fire that fly as far as I need to. It might be a long way without having so much reverb in the rod that it throws slack into the leader and prevents that fly from landing with control where I want it to a long ways away. So I want that rod to load, fire that fly, stop wiggling, and let the fly land where I want it, and then also have the rod be under control so I can feel things in case a big fish eats that fly right away when it hits the water. I want to be able to feel that, but I also want to be able to let that fly sink down into the water and feel potentially a bite that happens on a semi-slack line anywhere between the surface and getting to the bottom. So delivering the fly, having the rod dampen quickly, and then if you get a bite, that rod needs a certain power profile where as I go to set the hook, I know I need a certain amount of torque as that rod starts to bend to create the force to drive that hook home into the mouth of that fish. And then beyond that, I need to have the backbone to keep that fish hooked, fight that fish, and land that fish. And at the same time, I don't want to have any extra weight where that rod needs to be rigid all through the bottom and have enough backbone. I want the rod to be as sensitive as possible and be able to take out as much weight and wall thickness of material as possible to still have the rod to be powerful and sensitive and effective and also comfortable. And for me personally, where I ride that line, I can think of a situation where fishing big early season water with the original nymph rods I designed at T&T. So this was the contact 10-foot 8-inch 4-weight. And in big water, got a deep water bite just like I described, felt it, set the hook, had this really large fish on, was bringing it in, and I could see it was a massive fish. I landed it, I taped it, it was 27 inches, big, thick, wild river freestone trout. And with my 10-foot 8-inch 4-weight, corked over, I had about 8-pound test, wasn't gonna break the fish off, was landing it on a sandbar, boom, just blew up that 4-weight in a bend right at the middle ferrule. The rod broke, the line snapped there, but the fish was just on enough sand that I pinned it and I got it. But I remember thinking like, okay, there's the fine line between, the rigidity and the wall thickness and the internal diameter where I got on the wrong side of it in an actual fishing situation for me. The fish was huge, but it was within the realm of what I might be catching because I caught it, blew the rod up. And so, then I designed the next version of that rod was designed in a way where that wouldn't happen. It was based on the wall thickness, the diameter, and the materials, and the 4-weight ideal nymph and the new rods in Generation 4 Nymph here at Diamondback, that wouldn't happen. But having those specific instances of something like that with a failure on a big fish in a real fishing situation where nothing was really going wrong, and being the designer and knowing that I didn't do anything wrong, I was able to break a rod, on a fish like that. Those are the sorts of things to see in the field that really help, determine kind of mental guidelines for strength and what where products might fail. So for me, a lot of my personal experience using those 4 weights has been with these big river fish, and that has made my concept of what those rods need to do, and taking flies like these big flies that I like to use and knowing that the rod is going to do exactly what I want it to do to fish those flies, to target those big river fish. That has a lot to do with my overall understanding of what the action of nymph rods should be like, because I do more on the larger, bigger end of things, but it's really a sliding scale, and that power progression, action, all the things that make a rod really effective in a 4 weight, you can scale down, and that makes a nymph rod effective in, a 1 weight, or you could scale up and it makes it effective in a 7 weight. So just having that overall concept of knowing exactly what your equipment needs to do in specific situations, I think that is just like one of the biggest advantages for a designer, to have that experience that you can fall back on and not need to ask a pro a question, or have to refer to someone else's design to make sure that you're in the ballpark of getting things right.
Do you think there's anything you're still held back by in the design process, materials wise, that you feel like you can't you can't do yet, but maybe 5 years down the line you can do?
The back in 2012 or 2015, the amount of low-hanging fruit as far as developing the products, there was a lot more of it. Right now, that bar has been raised where there's a lot of great products, especially in those core trout sizes. In the sizes like the new 7-weight Generation IV Nymph Rod, that's where there is some, in 6 and 7 weight, people are using those rods more often, but there aren't really great established nymphing type rods in those line classes. So that's a place with these new designs where I think there is an opportunity to, really provide something dynamically better and different for the market. But it's going to be very hard right now to provide a new 2 or 3 weight rod that's just dynamically different and better than things on the market, because there's so many good things on the market. There's a lot of great products out there, and every time a great product comes out, everyone else can look at that product, and so the baseline for what you're doing, people catch up pretty quickly. So seeing these new products in 6 and 7 weight, I like to have the opportunity to kind of provide something that I just have the opportunity to set a bit of a standard for what a 7-weight nymph rod might be, because I feel like in the future there are going to be other things that are going to be powerful enough to Euro nymph up, use those tactics for something as big as a king salmon. And I think having a rod out there like this, other people will be looking at that product and being like, okay, put it on the deflection board, look at the backbone, look at the power profile, look at the wall thickness, look at the internal, external diameters. There's a lot that you can see from having that product out there once someone has done it well.
Where can people learn more about the rods that you have coming out?
There are going to be some great resources on our website. I'm doing something where all of the rods are going to come with a single page reference, that it's going to come on a nice a manila paper type heavy stock paper. It's going to be in a plastic bag. I'm going to sign them, and I have described exactly the reel balance weight, the line, after line match, the hook sizes that the rod power is going to work best with, and then just an overall description of what the rod design is intended to do. And because people are getting a lot more specialized with their products in the nymphing market, and a lot of the people who buy the nymphing rods are just highly technical people in the first place, I think that being able to provide this level of extra information about the rods that I'm going to put on the rods is going to be beneficial. It's a lot of the questions that I get through customer service are some of the topics that I'm answering in these questions. So that will also be on the website. It'll be on the diamondbackflyrods.com website will be the best resource to see stuff about the new Generation 4 rods.